Hello and welcome to our exclusive Q&A with Brad Feld as part of the Global Hack. So Brad, many of you will know, is a VC at the Foundry Group and the co-founder of Techstars, which is... Hello and welcome to our exclusive Q&A with Brad Feld as part of the... Sorry, I just got to pause my own audio coming back to me there. So Brad is the co-founder of Techstars, which is a really wonderful worldwide network supporting entrepreneurs and startups. And I know a lot of entrepreneurs really want to be part of it. And at the Global Hack, Brad is the track lead for crisis response, which is all about how we help those who help us, both on the front line and behind the scenes. But I know Brad will have lots of great advice today for everyone taking part in any of the tracks at the Global Hack. So Brad, good evening from Tallinn. Good morning in Colorado. I believe you're in Colorado.
I am in Boulder, yep.
Perfect. And how is the crisis currently affecting you and your teams?
Well, at lots of different levels. At Foundry Group, which is the venture capital fund that I'm part of, we have about 80 active portfolio companies and then investments in about 30 other early stage venture capital funds. And they've got many investments in the US. Obviously, the US economy and the world economy is having a very hard shutdown right now because of the reaction to trying to get ahead of COVID and the COVID crisis. So that's impacting a lot of companies. Interestingly, the companies tend to fall into three categories. Category one is companies that are significantly impacted by the shutdown of our overall economy, sort of our normal way of life. A simple line is if your company depends on people traveling or people going to the office, or going out to restaurants, things like that. Like you're in a very different place than you were even 30 days ago as a business, and you have a lot of distress. Then there's a bunch of companies where it's unclear how they're going to be impacted by this. And part of that is because the duration is impossible to predict, and the dynamics of how things roll back are also unpredictable. And then there are some companies that actually benefit from this dynamic because they provide critical products or services that are extremely helpful in a crisis like this. The one thing I've tried to help people understand is that we're actually dealing with three crises all happening simultaneously, and they're interlinked in a way that we've never experienced as a society, at least while any of us were alive. The first is a health crisis, which is the COVID pandemic, which is by far the most significant public health crisis I've ever experienced. I'm in my mid-50s, and I think most people living today, it's the most significant public health crisis they've ever experienced. And there are not really good ways to understand what to do with it yet. So people are rapidly scrambling to try to figure out on the health crisis side how to get in front of this problem so that we can have sort of a more stable society. That leads into an economic crisis. Most economic crises are not triggered by something exogenous like a health crisis. They're usually a function of a structural part of the economy having a problem and then tipping over the rest of the economy. Here we have a very strong economy prior to the health crisis, but the health crisis and the reaction to the health crisis is creating a very substantial economic crisis. That leads to a third crisis, which is one I think that is almost always there in a crisis, but in this particular case is more severe, which is a mental health crisis is the simplest way to label it. People are not used to being sequestered in their houses all the time with their families, unable to interact with other people other than this way, via video. And I think across, not just in countries, but across society broadly, while there are many people that are being very innovative around how to interact this way, whether it's work or hackathons or others, the pressures on individuals, especially families, lower income families, families that don't have resources, people that don't have a stable place to live, people who are in transition, very difficult, independent of our own as humans, individual struggles. So I think the interlinkage of these three crises is very powerful, and we've been trying to help the founders that we work with navigate this, not just for their businesses, but also for themselves and for all the people that work for them.
And so people taking part in the Global Hack have sent in their own questions, and Michael has one related to that, which is about kind of in previous crises, we've seen kind of superstar founders emerge from this crisis, like the 2008 financial crisis. Is that likely to be similar this time? Is it even true, or is it a kind of myth about great companies about bad times?
Well, I'd separate the two things. Many great companies emerge out of crises and are founded during periods of economic downturn. So that's not a myth. That's a truism. But it's not a myth that is oppositional. There are many great companies that are created when there's not a crisis. So in some ways, it's more reassurance to people that not only can a great company be created when the economy is good and when there's not a crisis, great companies can be created when the economy is bad and when there are crises. So I'd separate that from the first part of the question, which is superstar founders coming out of crises. I don't like that phrasing very much. I think that really amazing founders emerge all the time. I think that leadership is tested in crises. When things are good, leadership is not often tested. You don't have to be an extraordinary leader to be successful when the wind is at your back, or whatever cliche you want to use. But when you're in a crisis, it really separates extraordinary leaders from everybody else. And in the context of being a founder, a key part of being a founder is being a strong leader, regardless of the size of your company. And so that leadership dynamic becomes amplified, or the importance of that leadership dynamic becomes amplified in a crisis. So I guess the thing I react negatively to is the label superstar. The concept is fine, but it's sort of fetishizing or heroizing the founder in this concept, and recognizing, in fact, that really what we need as a society is not just great founders, but great leaders, where those founders who are great will also be great leaders.
Okay. And I can see Pankaj Mazum has asked kind of like what industries are likely to come out the best and worst from this crisis. And there's kind of a related question from Martin Beckberger, which is about how will this crisis affect kind of people's behavior kind of long term in terms of customers? Like, so not just how will the crisis hit industries directly, but how will it lead to longer term changes in what customers actually want and what do they need?
Yeah, I don't really know the long-term dynamics. I think that's a question from a predictive perspective, and I think it's too early to predict or prognosticate. I think there's lots and lots of people doing that, and so there's lots and lots of data in the world. But generally speaking, I think most of it's pretty random because it's not really clear how this is going to play out and how this is going to evolve, other than that there are going to be very significant structural shifts in our society and the way we interact, both in a business context and a non-business context. In terms of the types of businesses that benefit from this, companies that have anything to do with health and health-related issues have a real significant opportunity here. We have country by country, there's different health systems, and some of those health systems have very different characteristics. Certainly, I'm very familiar with the health system in the US. I'm only tangentially familiar with health systems in other countries. It's pretty clear that all of them have challenges around lots of different dimensions. And there's a lot of opportunity to learn, not just from the way you manage healthcare or manage reaction to a pandemic or manage and develop new drugs or process and incorporate new therapies into how things work, but really the intersection of the technology that many of us take for granted in lots of other parts of our lives, which has not really become part of, at least in the United States, the web of the healthcare system in a productive way. And it's not just telehealth, it's a whole series of different kinds of things, all of which intersect with each other all the time. And so in the context of that, I think, understanding that as an entrepreneur and not trying to focus on a very narrow thing around this particular crisis, but instead trying to abstract and figure out how to functionally evolve the way that we interact from a technological perspective. I think many other examples are things like we've just had the tipping point where remote work is now something that everybody is experiencing. There are a number of companies that are fully remote in the tech industry, very few companies that are fully remote anywhere outside the tech industry. And most of the companies that operate in a fully remote mode tend to be small. Lots and lots of companies have distributed workforces or multiple offices. All of a sudden, the entirety of the workforce, at least in the US and in many other countries, is now working from home. And so the inadequacy of many of the things that are in that product and process chain are huge opportunities for companies. Not just, by the way, the tooling to allow you to do video conferencing, but all of the ways that you engage with each other in a work and business context. I could keep going. There's plenty of hardware innovations, I think, in this moment that are significant. We're already seeing it based on just the massive challenge with certain types of procurement systems, allocation of goods in different parts of the world, especially around PPE, but also new technologies that have existed for, in some cases, a while around destroying viruses, sterilizing material that really isn't in common use in public spaces, might be in common use in medical environments, but we're going to have the same problem in public spaces. So huge opportunities for those types of companies.
And Brad, like the face-to-face contact can be really important in business. Obviously, we can't do that for the foreseeable future. Like, how does that affect how founders, still get the attention of VCs and impress them? Like, lots of people in the global hack are going to be trying to impress you remotely. And do you have any tips for how kind of founders navigate that?
Yeah, I think it varies by investor and by investor type. So if I use myself as an example, I've made a number of investments without ever having physically met the founders. I met them via video conferencing and had spent lots of time with them via video and via email, and have had that experience over long periods of time. One of my favorite examples of that is Fitbit, which was a very successful investment for us. And I don't think I physically was in person with James and Eric, the two founders, until about 3 months after we'd made our first investment. So I think the positive of this is that for many entrepreneurs, remote interaction or non-physical interaction as the first touch point with an investor will increase in its accessibility. And so your ability to quickly have a video interaction with somebody who's interested in you or who you get referred to as a starting point will become more prevalent. Whereas right now, even 6 months ago, 3 months ago, yeah, well, maybe you got a phone call with somebody, maybe you had an email interaction with somebody, but it usually was in an effort to get a face-to-face meeting. I think that could actually benefit entrepreneurs because there's a lot less friction to have that first meeting, which really is a goal to get a second meeting. And if your first meeting is one where you have success and value in the interaction with the investor, if you don't have to get in front of them physically, you can save yourself a lot of time on that. So, what are the tricks to that? I don't have any tricks to that. Like that's right. Right now you say, well, I can't get any investors to pay attention to me right now. That's not surprising because most investors are very, very busy with their existing portfolios and probably with their families and with their existing lives, just trying to be organized around this crisis. But that'll change. And when that changes, I think the availability and willingness of investors to engage via video conference will be much higher.
Mm. And from the questions sent in, I can see a lot of people are very interested to know about your own investments and how your strategy has changed since the crisis began. So what have you invested in recently and what are you more likely to shift towards going forwards?
Yeah, I don't know that our investment strategy going forward will change in any meaningful way. We have a set of themes at Foundry that we invest in. If you're interested, go to foundrygroup.com/themes. They tend to be fairly horizontal, so they catch a decent number of different types of things, but they all have very specific characteristics that we're looking for. Along the path of that, what's useful to realize is we have now 30 or so partner funds, and and these are other early stage venture funds. The vast majority of our direct investments are companies that those partner funds have already done a seed or pre-seed investment in, and we're often following them into a Series A type financing. So from the standpoint of pre-seed and seed investing, Foundry Group has shifted away from that. If you think about Techstars as a vehicle, and so people have the clarity of the dynamic there. I'm one of the co-founders. I'm on the board of Techstars, but I don't run it day by day. David Brown and David Cohen, who are two of the other co-founders, lead it. And interestingly, in the context of Techstars, I think the opportunities for companies to participate with an accelerator, especially with the corporate partners who are focused on innovation, will increase meaningfully coming out of this period. Because there's very specific focuses of those types of activities. Anybody that is familiar with Techstars, there's about 50 programs a year around the world right now, running 10 companies per program. But many of them have very specific thematic focuses because of the corporate partner or partners involved. And that's very powerful because those can adjust based on what the contemporary dynamics are. And I think it's worth for very, very early stage entrepreneurs to pay attention to those themes that those accelerators are focused on, because many of them tend to be ahead of or leading where the overall market is investing.
And so, Brad, if you have one of those companies that is most exposed to this crisis, for example, there was a question from Annalise Pardo-Tarabay, who it sounds like she works in the events industry and is understandably quite concerned at the moment. But if you're a founder of a company really exposed to this crisis, or particularly this lockdown, kind of how should your approach change?
So short term, be really pragmatic about the economic realities of your business. If you're in the events business, and you had any meaningful revenue, your revenue probably went to zero or close to zero. Your new business opportunities in front of you are probably non-existent. And whatever cash you have in the bank, the key is to make that cash last as long as you possibly can, because it's unclear when we will come out of this and things will get back to normal. And so your action should be to figure out what staff you actually need to run your business today, and to do the hard thing, which is to lay off people in the immediate short term to get there. It's a terrible time to do that, but that's the functional reality of the business, whether it's laying people off or furloughing them or asking them to take very reduced salaries. Your goal is to make your cash last so that you're in a position that when whatever your business activity is starts to come back, you can build your business back up quickly. If you assume that in 30 days business is going to come back and don't take any of those actions and you spend all your money, you can't get the money back. So, my advice for an events business would be figure out how to hibernate as much as you can while still keeping the essential value of what you've got, but letting the cash that you have last as long as possible. If you haven't really scaled up the business yet and you're really in the ideation stage and you're still trying to get things going and you're shipping your first product or working on your first product, it's actually a good time to sort of look at what your customer dynamics are going to be, what you anticipated them, and possibly make adjustments. So for example, I'll just go back to the event company. I know of an event company in the Bay Area that was growing quickly, that was having events at bars. And so they were being hired by lots of local bars to then get groups of people to come to an event, and they helped set up the live music and they helped set up whatever special deals, and then they helped promote the event.
Brad, I'm not sure if you can still hear me, but it's broken up on my end. I think we may have lost Brad, unless you can still hear me. I'll give a bit more time to see if we can reconnect. This is one of the joys of live broadcasting. Hopefully we can reconnect. Yeah, so I'm not sure what's happened on Brad's end, but it's been a really interesting discussion. I'm just going to give him a bit more time to try and log back in, maybe, or for his internet to keep working. Hello, Brad.
The joy of the internet.
Yep.
Anyway, the end of that story that I probably got cut off in was the company that's the event company I was describing has now shifted to doing virtual events for these same sort of branded opportunities, including, by the way, bars and restaurants who want to be sponsors of and involved in it. So I think you can modify your business model aggressively if you're small to try to incorporate new characteristics and use this time period to experiment with them and see if they work.
And I've been surprised, actually. I've been going to a lot of events still online, kind of including with businesses that I'd usually go out to, and they're putting it online. Like my partner did an online art class last night, which he usually goes to once a week. So even events companies are finding ways to keep their business going.
Absolutely.
You know, we've talked a bit about the companies kind of worst affected, but on the other end of the scale, there was an interesting question here from Vadim Barasov about age tech. And he's talking about elderly people are particularly worst affected by this lockdown. And there's also this digital divide. Is it time, he's asking, to invest specifically in technology for older adults, or to help older adults more into using digital technology as well?
Well, I think it's a good reminder of the value of that. You know, it's a category that periodically gets some attention. I think generally speaking, the attention that it gets, though, is sort of fleeting versus where there's real transformative change. And especially in this environment where a lot of older people are isolated from their family, they don't have easy access to a lot of the resources they need. It's a lot clearer where the benefit of those things will be versus the theoretical opportunities. So my hope is that there is a lot of research and exploration and product development there. There was a great article in the MIT Technology Review maybe a month or two ago, a series of articles about technology and aging and different things that people were doing. So, you know, it is front of mind, and this is for sure a situation that accelerates that.
And maybe if we talk specifically about the global hack, I can see Joe Pakal has asked about what you're looking for in the global hack. Can you give participants some tips about kind of what kind of solutions you most want to see? I think you've probably got one of the most challenging tracks, which is crisis response. But any tips you can give in general would be fantastic.
Yeah, look, in general, I think it's, I would cycle back on not so much what I want to see, but I would encourage people to work on things that they are personally obsessed about. It's an ongoing mantra of ours at Foundry, which is that you should be working on something you are put on planet Earth to do. And especially in this context where you have an enormous human crisis going on globally that's disrupting our lives at many, many levels. Take the time that you're committing to the global hack and work on something that's really meaningful to you, rather than something that you think somebody else might potentially be interested in. Because essentially, if you're an entrepreneur, that's the best way to organize and approach things, is to focus on those things that you're obsessed about.
And are there any particular companies in your portfolio that you could use as an example for the company that's really kind of doing well through these periods, or something you're particularly passionate about?
Well, there's a number of them. I think one that I find really, really interesting in this moment is this company Whoop that makes this band. It's whoop.com. And it's, I still wear my Fitbit, but it's a different kind of product. It doesn't have a screen. It's very focused on collecting much, much more data per second than any of the other wearables, and then using that data in their system to come up with actionable health and wellness insights on a continual basis, and make them actionable in a way that's easy for people to understand. And I found it to be extremely useful for me to understand on a day-by-day basis how I'm doing, how my sleep affected me, how the stress from the day before affected me, not just what my resting heart rate is, but what my HRV is, It keeps track of data like respiratory rate and is able to calculate all these things and then put it in a way where I say, I'm okay, I'm not okay. They're starting to do, they just had a long expose or blog post on data that they're getting from their system as it relates to people who have COVID. Because one of the things they let you do on a daily basis when you check in with your journal is say whether you have COVID or not. It's anonymous data that they work with, but they're starting to get some correlations between not data at a moment in time, but the trending data, especially since we know, for example, that the asymptomatic period for COVID could be as much as 2 weeks. So what things are changing while you're asymptomatic in terms of not displaying symptoms, but at the same time might be changing in terms of other physiological patterns that you have that could be a trigger to say, you might be infected. So I find that one particularly interested in this moment.
Okay. Brad, I've got to ask, because there's people watching this from all over the world and joining the global hack from all over the world. And, we're using remote technology pretty well. Sometimes it doesn't work. What are your thoughts about remote teams, having remote companies? Is this crisis going to lead to kind of more remote teams? Is that going to become the normal? Or is it still good to have a team together offline and a solid location with a good reputation for finding talent locally?
Well, I may never leave my house again. I've always been a remote worker. I don't really like to go to the office that much. And consequently, the whole idea of remote work has been something that I've done for a long time. I used to travel all the time. So even, if you're a constant traveler, you're effectively a remote worker. I think it'll become a much more integrated part of the way we work. And, I know of a number of CEOs in our world who are questioning whether they need the office that they have, whether they, need to have that kind of a physical space for everybody to be in. I know that there's a lot of people who like to have time at home because they talk about how much more work they get done. Interestingly, when you have your family in your house with you, that may or may not be true, but it's certainly notable when you're working from home to think about how much less friction you have moving between meetings, moving from one physical location to another, dealing with sort of the dynamics of being in an office. But it is a very different work modality. Some people love it, some people hate it. But I do think it'll be much more woven into the way we work in the future.
What about purely from a credibility point of view? Would you consider a company to be more credible if it had a prestigious office? I know sometimes kind of people work remotely, but try and make it look like they have, they're all in the same office when they're not. You wouldn't recommend, you recommend kind of people are more open about the fact that they are.
Yeah, I don't care. I personally don't care about any of that. I've always thought there's a long-standing cliche from the 80s and 90s in the tech business that once a company built its own building, you knew it was on the downswing of their success. Not uniformly true, but there were plenty of examples of companies that, their last great move as a company was to unveil this incredible headquarters building that they built. I don't think, especially for entrepreneurial companies, I think we're way over-indexed again on space. And the cost of space is extremely high, especially in cities like New York and the Bay Area and Seattle. I'm sure it's true in London and Tokyo and probably many other cities. The importance of that kind of an office environment, especially for early stage startups, is, I guess it's intellectually interesting, but it's just really not essential for many of the things that we do, especially if your work is either heads down in front of a computer all day, or it's work where you're actually physically building new products that require that kind of product engineering. So, I think the need for the nice office, the need for all the different types of things that you have in the nice office, which are fine. I think the importance of that will diminish coming out of this crisis.
Good. I've already taken up lots of your time, so I just want to ask, why did you get involved in the Global Hack? And have you been involved in many hackathons before? And how successful do you think they are?
Yeah, I love hackathons in general. Techstars is about to start doing a virtual startup weekend every weekend across the world. So same kind of construct in some ways. I don't know whether Global Hack is emulating Startup Weekend or is different, specifically, but conceptually same kinds of ideas virtually. So I'm a big fan of this phenomena. I like to support anybody who's doing it because I think that organizing lots and lots of people, especially in this moment, to work on difficult and challenging problems is an awesome thing. And then I'd go even further in terms of my own interest is I've consciously decided to spend about an hour a day during this period of time doing externally facing things like this. And I would say a lot of it is selfish. I enjoy this a lot. So it's not for any other reason than in the midst of my own stresses of the day-to-day of dealing with this crisis. It gives me pleasure to be able to engage with you and hopefully to be helpful to a bunch of other people and to see the results of hardworking people on the creative vector of something like the Global Hack.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Brad. That's all been so useful. And everyone else is looking forward to seeing you online at the Global Hack as well. And I'm just going to end by saying so for anyone who hasn't signed up yet for the Global Hack, it's globalhack.com. And tomorrow, 9th of April, is going to be the last day to submit your ideas for this world-saving hackathon. So please do submit them. And also join the Slack group. It's globalhack.com/Slack. And that will take you to the Slack channel where you can speak to lots of other people taking part this weekend. Yeah, for now though, Brad, thank you so much for giving up your time.
My pleasure. And shout out to Chris Schroeder, who's a longtime friend who got me connected in. So Chris, thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
See ya.